Hi, welcome to Dogen Sprint 29 demo bar stop. So for this sprint, as per the last few sprints, all the work was mainly internal. I mean, there was a couple of tasks that are very minor that did have a little bit of a user impact. I might just talk about them a little bit in this release notes, but they're extremely minor and they're not particularly useful at present. So it's not really that crucial. The work that was actually quite crucial was the formattables refactor, which was the beginning of the sort of technical space specific refactor we did this sprint. And if you have a quick look at how things stood the previous sprint inside of the technical space specific models, such as for example text.cpp, as you can see here, you can see that we had the namespace called formattables as we had for a while, and there was still quite a few classes still there. You can also see, as I mentioned in previous release notes, we were still using the pre-MDU terminology, so there's lots of strange terms such as expanders and workflows and reducers and adapters, and all sorts of things that are really sort of the legacy way of doing things, as well as of course the formattables model itself, which is now understood to be not particularly helpful. So the first bit of work that we did this sprint was to get rid of the remaining entities that we had here in the formattables namespace in each of the technical space specific models, and it was quite involved. We moved a number of things to their rightful places, such as for example the helper properties got moved to the logical model. We tidied up the remainder of the aspects related to the formattables model where it makes sense. So for example, it didn't really make a lot of sense to keep formattables model, as we found out quite a while ago, as well as all of these other properties that are associated with this. So we tidied all of that up and got rid of all these properties, so that by the end of this task there was literally nothing left in the formattables model and the namespace was deleted. As I mentioned in the release notes, all of this was documented with some coding videos, so if you're interested, have a quick look at the playlist for that. So then once we got rid of the formattables model, we then move over to tackle the helpers. And the helpers are also a technical space specific model activity. So as you can see here, there's a number of classes such as smart pointer helper and many others, such as all these guys here, which were modeled as a plain manually handcrafted class in the past. They did make use of stitch transforms, but they were largely handcrafted really. So the job of this class, of this sprint, was to formalize a little bit the meta model representation for these entities. Now we didn't really want to spend too much time on this because this is throwaway work, but we needed to give it the absolute minimal sort of support so that it could be moved across to the new world. And in order to do that, we needed to add these entities to the physical meta model. So you see that now there is a physical representation for helpers, as well as all the associated paraphernalia that comes along with it. And as part of that, we created the types in the logical meta model, as you can see here, and added support for code generation for helpers. And it was rather painful, but we managed to get through it. We had to move quite a lot of code, a lot of tidy up, a lot of clean up, and slot it in the new combined text model. So as you can see here, the helpers now have their own meta type, and they hook into the infrastructure that we've got in place. Though, like I say, it's sort of throwaway work, but it had to be done just in order to enable us to move forwards and to continue with our refactoring. So once we're done with that, then actually we just skipped something here. So we're missing a story here in our release notes in our presentation. The next task that we did was to tidy up all of the transforms that we've had in the technical space specific models, and to create common infrastructure in the merged text model, and to move them across. And so as you can see on the previous sprints technical space specific models, there was still a lot of hackery. We had, for example, the representation of the backend had the namespace called transforms, which is obviously incorrect because it should really mirror the backend that is representing. And like this, there was many other sort of issues like that. But at the end of this sprint, we now have a very clean architecture where the top level namespace transforms then contains all the physical metamodel elements, such as the C++ backend, the C# backend, and so forth. And all of the associated model to text infrastructure was tidied up and moved across to this new world, including a lot of cleanup in each and every stitch transform and all of the properties that are associated with the stitch transform. So it was actually quite a gigantic amount of work, not particularly creative work really, quite boring and repetitive and very error prone, but somehow I managed to go through it and get all that out of the way. And then finally the last story as per our presentation was to look at the codec models. And in the codec models, the work that was done was mainly to get rid of, to combine all of the different codec models into a model-driven engineering representation, and to convert these sort of modelets that we had in the past into proper transforms. So now you can see here we have a model to JSON transform, and we have the converse, the JSON to model transform part of a chain, a JSON artifact to model transform, as you can see here. And each of the top level chains is actually responsible for orchestrating and deciding what codec to use. And it's all nice and very model-driven engineering sort of based, which was quite nice to do. We did manage to do most of the work on codecs, didn't quite get to the end of it, sadly. We could not quite complete the work on the dia codec, so that's still using the legacy terminology and approach, but hopefully early in the next sprint we shall tackle that. As part of this exercise, we also ended up tidying up a little bit of the org codec, still not using a proper model as you'd expect, so that will be something for next sprint. But at least we're making the look and feel of the org model as close as possible to the end result. As you can see here, this is the org representation of the model for the text transforms, and as you can see, it's very similar to what you're seeing there in dia, and the stitch templates are here, so they're very easy to edit now using just regular org functionality. You can make your changes, and once you're finished with it, you can just go back to org and edit the model as required. So that was the work on org modes as part of the codec cleanup, and that kind of more or less wraps things up with this sprint really. It was very long and intense and sprint, but the net result of it was that we now have a very nice architecture, the architecture is now mapping the conceptual model, which is something we've tried for quite a long time. Part of it is, as you probably know by looking at the release notes, part of it is moving sideways slightly because we didn't really, some of this is literally just to move things around and to get them in the right shape rather than actually fundamental changes. So it involved creating some transforms that throw away, some legacy transforms as you can see here. But it does mean that now at least we don't have to carry so much conceptual baggage in our heads every time we're trying to do some work, and we can rely on the architecture actually sort of representing faithfully the ideas in the conceptual model. So that's quite pleasing. And so hopefully we'll finish that tidy up next sprint and resume our work on the physical meta model. And that was it. That's all for this sprint. Thanks very much for watching.